Why did you destroy my life because you thought my stepbrother deserved to be with my fiancée more than me? My father died when I was 15, and by that time, he and my mother were not particularly close anymore. So, while it was a huge blow for me, she didn't seem to be as affected as one might expect. When I was 17, I joined the army. During my first year away from home, my mother remarried. My stepfather and I didn't really get along. We just had different personalities. He often made sarcastic remarks and told me to be a man if I complained about some unpleasantness. This caused arguments between us, and I was no less guilty than he was, although it never escalated to anything serious. I was discharged due to health reasons after nearly 5 years of service, and my mother and stepfather said they would be happy if I temporarily lived with them. I replied that it would be only for a short while, until I found a job and got back on my feet. I even offered to pay for my accommodation, but they refused. However, 3 days after my return, my stepfather, when we were alone, asked what I considered a fair rental amount. I was puzzled, but it was his house, so we agreed on a sum, and I didn't tell my mother, assuming he didn't want her to know. Since he never mentioned the payment in her presence, I never asked them for anything because I wanted to do everything myself. My stepfather had a son from a previous marriage. We had no common interests, but there were never any problems between us either. I would say we got along. The only thing that always bothered me a little was that my mother and stepfather helped him with everything paid for his education, car, accommodation during college, and even after. I was only a few months older than him, so he went to college right after their wedding. As I said, I didn't need their help, but it was unpleasant that he was given everything while I was immediately asked for rent. But overall, I didn't hold a grudge. I moved out after 3 months, and soon after, I met a girl I was completely infatuated with, and we started dating. These were my first relationships, and I was always on cloud nine. You know that feeling of being in love at the beginning of a relationship that just doesn't fade away. I was very scared to bring her home. My mother and I were very close, and I was afraid she would be too critical of the girl I would bring. However, my fears were unfounded, and they got along very well. My girlfriend practically had no family, that's a long story, so my mother and stepfather became a kind of replacement for her. She and my mother became so close that they sometimes even spent time together without me, and I was very happy about that. My stepfather also liked my girlfriend very much, and I felt that it brought us closer, although I hadn't thought I wanted that before. About a year after the start of our relationship, I realized that she was the girl I wanted to marry. I told my mother and stepfather, and they both seemed very happy. She had practically already become part of our family. My mother gave me her engagement ring, which my father had once given her. My job didn't bring in much income, and I decided that even if the ring didn't stay with her forever, it would be a great temporary option. When I proposed, my girlfriend said that it was not temporary at all, and that she really liked it. I had never been happier in my life. We started planning the wedding, and my mother and stepfather said they would help with the finances. It was the first time they had offered me financial help, and it meant a lot to me. About 3 months later, my stepfather called me and said I needed to come over. It seemed a bit strange, but after work, I went to their place. When I arrived, my mother, stepfather, stepbrother, and my fiancée were there. She was sitting on the sofa, and it was obvious she had been crying. I immediately thought someone had died and wanted to sit down next to her, but my stepfather stopped me. He began to accuse me of cheating on her throughout our relationship. I was completely bewildered and told everyone that I didn't even communicate with other women unless they were my relatives. It turned out that some girl had gotten my fiancée's number and told her that we had supposedly been sleeping together for over a year. Moreover, she didn't know I was in a relationship. She sent her screenshots of the messages and knew things about me that a random stranger couldn't know. Like a fool, I didn't understand what was happening right before my eyes. I was stunned as she looked at me from the other end of the room, asking to see my phone to make sure I hadn't done anything like that. She and my mother were both crying, and I started crying too. My stepfather called me all sorts of names and kicked me out of the house, saying he would call the police if he saw me on his property again. In the following weeks, I tried unsuccessfully to contact my fiancé calls, messages, voice messages, any messaging apps. Everything was unanswered. After these weeks, my stepfather called me and told me to stop trying to contact her and that I would never be a welcome guest in his house or in his family's circle again. I tried to call my mother all this time, but also without success. About a month later, the only thing I received was a message from my mother saying how sad she was and how disappointed she was. My mother had almost no relatives, so they always celebrated holidays with my stepfather's family. They all also turned away from me. I saw their Christmas photos on Facebook where my ex-fiancée looked happy and calm, and it crushed me. The only people who continued to communicate with me were my father's brother and his family, but even they seemed wary of me. The only person who I think really believed me was my uncle. Honestly, I don't know how I would have coped without him. I have never been so grateful to anyone. About 6 months after all this, I moved to California in an attempt to escape from all this. About a year after the move, I received a call from a phone number from my home state, which happened very rarely. I answered, and it was my stepbrother. I immediately hung up. He called back, but I ignored the call. Although it didn't leave my mind all day, I decided that if he called again, I would answer. He really called later in the evening. The conversation was, to say the least, awkward. He told me that my fiancée had been in a depressed state for a long time, and that it took her almost a year to even start looking for a new partner. I hadn't been dating anyone during that time at all. A few months after that, my stepfather persuaded my brother to invite her on a date, which he did. The first few meetings went well, but apparently nothing came of it. He told my stepfather about it, and he replied, "I didn't just get rid of your brother for nothing. She's a great girl, you need to get together with her." I almost collapsed, and that feeling quickly turned to anger. It turns out my stepfather found a girl, I still don't know who it was, to play the role of the one I supposedly had a romance with. He faked the screenshots of the messages and passed them on to her so she could send them to my fiancée. My stepbrother said he confessed to him about this about a month ago, and he didn't know what to do with this information. Obviously, it tormented him so much that he could no longer keep it to himself. So he decided to tell me everything and added that he was going to talk to my mother and fiancé the next day. He called me first so I would be aware and know what to say if they called. I told him where I currently live and asked them not to contact me immediately so I would have time to think about everything. This happened last Tuesday. Today I wrote to my brother that I am ready to talk to them if they want, and that they can call me tomorrow. I have no idea what I will say, nor do they. Honestly, I expect there will be a lot of tears and apologies. I'm not sure I'm ready to forgive anyone or anything like that. The only person I've told about all this is my uncle, whom I asked not to tell anyone. Sorry for such a long story. My psychologist chose a lousy week to go on vacation, and I needed to get it off my chest. Update first. 4 days have passed. This morning, my stepbrother called me and told me what happened over the past week. It turns out that what my stepfather told my brother was not exactly what my brother told me. He explained that my stepfather was very careful in his words so as not to incriminate himself. He spoke in such a way as to unambiguously hint at what he had done but not admit it directly. This is what I understood about my stepbrother. He is much smarter than me. Instead of immediately going to my mother and former fiancé with this information and confronting his father, he chose a different path that I wouldn't have even thought of. Somehow he got access to my former fiancée's phone and found the girl. He said it took him forever to find her. He called her and persuaded her to meet him in a public place, and that's when everything came to light. It turned out that the girl had met my stepfather on Tinder, which in my opinion clearly indicates that he was cheating on my mother. This made me even more angry, for obvious reasons. The girl claims that they didn't have an intimate relationship, but whether it's true or not is no longer important to me. What's important is that my stepbrother talked to her and pressured her feelings by telling her the whole story and what happened. For reference, she obviously knew what she was doing. Maybe time and the realization of what happened awakened her conscience, but for me, that's also not important. She told what happened. She was paid $1,000 for the phone call. That was the deal. She was given a script of what to say and provided with evidence in the form of a photo. She made the call, and that was it. My stepbrother asked her to tell everything to my mother and former fiancé. He even offered to pay her again. She agreed to do it for free, and it happened yesterday. My stepfather was on a business trip until Wednesday, so the meeting was attended by only 4 people. My mother, my former fiancé, my stepbrother, and the girl who caused the breakup. She came and told everything she knew. My stepbrother said the tears started almost immediately for all 3 women. After the conversation, he told them that I was in California and said he would talk to me when I was ready. This was before I wrote to him. Now, a little backstory to help you understand something about my mother and former fiancé. This is not an excuse for their actions, just to help you better understand the situation. After my father's death, my mother and I were inseparable. We were a support for each other. When I was 16, I developed bad habits because I wanted to somehow numb all these emotions. I promised my mother that we would spend New Year's Eve together, but instead, I stayed with friends, getting drunk. My mother spent that night alone at home. She wrote to me how sad and lonely she was, and since then, our relationship was never the same. I felt absolutely lousy, and from that moment on, I pulled myself together until my life started to fall apart. My mother is one of those people who always needs someone around. She can't cope with loneliness. I think when her love with my father began to fade, I filled that void. And when I grew up and left home, that void was filled by my stepfather. Now, about my former fiancée, as I mentioned, she practically has no family. Because of this, she has serious trust issues, and her past relationships, which were far from rosy, only made it worse. Despite all this, she never spoke ill of her ex-boyfriends, which I always respected. One of them was abusive, and that was the only exception. I, despite my extreme shyness, often heard that I was nice, especially from girls younger than me. I never liked this definition because it sounded not very masculine. But over time, I came to accept it and learned to appreciate my boyish face and how often I blush. My fiancé was almost 3 years older than me. I always liked older girls and never paid attention to girls aged 18 to 20, even if they showed interest in me. However, this did not stop them, which very much upset my fiancé. She often asked why I wasn't interested in these girls, or why I didn't leave for someone younger and prettier. But I always found her incredibly attractive, much more beautiful than myself, and constantly reminded her of that, asserting that I needed no one but her. I hope this helps you better understand why I think my mother and my former fiancé acted the way they did, and why they believed the lie. Again, this is not an excuse for their actions, and I can't say I understand them. At the end of the conversation with my brother, he said that my mother and my former fiancé wanted to call me today, and I said I agreed. I sat and waited. By 3 p.m., I started to worry. I even thought he might have made it all up to mock me. Then I received a message from my brother asking if everything was okay. I answered yes and asked if they were going to call at all. Today, he answered that my mother and former fiancé had been trying to contact me for the last few hours. I remembered that I had blocked both of them when I moved and had forgotten about it. Why I didn't block my brother, I don't know, but I'm glad I didn't. I unblocked their numbers, and about 10 minutes later, my mother called. The first thing she said was, "You sound different." I almost hung up right then and there. It took all my strength to just say yes. She immediately burst into tears. I thought I would feel more, but I didn't. I would be lying if I said I felt nothing at all, but the pain of what happened outweighed her words. She asked if I had received her message, and I said no. Apparently, she had been trying to write to me for the last year, but I had blocked her number. If she had really wanted to contact me, she would have found a way. Perhaps this sounds harsh, but I know it's true. I told her straight out that I was ready to try to build some kind of relationship with her, but over time. She was also happy about this. She said she was packing all her things from the house before my stepfather returned and that she would immediately file for divorce. I believe her. Maybe she is a bad mother in my eyes, but she never did anything by halves. I would really like to see the face of that bastard when he returns to an empty house. My former fiancé took the phone next and offered the same tearful apologies as my mother. With her, I felt a little more. I even tried to make her remember how many times I had said I would never do anything like that to her, and how much I loved her. She was horrified, and honestly, it even brought me some satisfaction. We talked for about half an hour, and the conversation was quite pleasant. Although I had been telling myself for a whole year that this would never happen again, I thought that maybe we still had a chance. She said she was still keeping the ring, and that infuriated me. I told her to give it to my mother because it no longer belongs to either of us. It was clear how much this upset her, and honestly, I wanted it to be so. She asked if she could call or message me, and I said yes, but not to expect quick replies. I gave her almost the same ultimatum as my mother, although I added that the chances of any future relationships are extremely slim. She said she understood that too. Finally, I talked to my brother and thanked him for everything he had done. He helped my mother pack her things from his father's house. He apologized for everything that happened and said he was going to tell the rest of the family the whole truth. I have no connection with them and think I never will, except for my stepfather's grandmother. She is the oldest in the whole family and congratulated me on my birthday and Christmas last year. Perhaps she is old enough to not care, or maybe she just feels sorry for me. But I am going to talk to her. As strange as it may be, I am flying home for my uncle's 60th birthday in the first week of March, and this will be my first visit home since I left. I definitely plan to see my brother. I don't mind seeing my mother and former fiancé, but I made it clear to them that I need a lot of time to recover. If something new happens, I will write another update, perhaps after this trip home, but for now, that's all. Short update. I received a call from a number from my home state. I answered, and it was my stepfather. He said, "Hello," and I immediately hung up and blocked his number. I immediately called my mother, former fiancé, and brother. All of them are safe and not near him. My mother is in a hotel that he doesn't know about. The former fiancé and brother are at their home. My stepfather, by all indications, is not an aggressive person, but it's better to be safe. My brother said his father called him in the morning when he returned home and found my mother there, but my brother didn't answer. Then he told my stepfather what happened and told him not to try to contact any of us. I don't know how long he sat there thinking, but he called me around 3 p.m. Pacific time an hour ago. I received a message from another number. "We need to talk." I think it's him again. I didn't answer. That's all for now. Second short update. My stepfather's mother called me. I had her number saved, as I mentioned earlier. At first, I thought it might be my stepfather, but it wasn't. She is a very nice woman who didn't have to be kind to me, but she showed compassion. She wished me all the best and apologized on behalf of the family. I thanked her and also wished her all the best. It's amazing that this woman helped raise such a person as my stepfather. Second update. A month has passed. Sorry for the delay, there was a lot of work, and I just returned home last weekend. I thought long and hard about that message, and it turned out it really was from my stepfather. Curiosity got the better of me, and I called him. By the way, I did what I was advised and recorded the conversation using an app. It's a pity I can't say that this call gave me anything. Hearing his voice literally made me flinch. He asked how I was doing, and I told him to stop that nonsense, and he just laughed. Of course, the conversation didn't contain anything compromising or anything important. I still asked him why he couldn't accept that my fiancé and I were together. He replied that I wasn't man enough, and that such a woman would be wasted on me. His view of relationships is very traditional, which is especially funny considering that he never understood either our relationship or her. Without going into details, my former fiancée was and remains a person who doesn't particularly adhere to gender norms. She has a very well-paying job and said she could never be a housewife or a stay-at-home wife. She often took the initiative in our relationship. In short, there wasn't much to take from this conversation. I still didn't understand what he wanted, but at the end I told him not to call me again and hung up. Nothing particularly noteworthy happened last week. I flew home for my uncle's birthday party. The family welcomed me warmly, expressing regret that they hadn't supported me in that situation. None of them were ever rude to me, so I don't hold a grudge. I talked to my brother, and we agreed to meet at his house with my mother and former fiancé on Wednesday evening. On Wednesday, I went to see him, and I got what I expected. A lot of tears and apologies. I admit it was hard to keep myself in check. I talked to each of them separately. My mother has already filed for divorce, which is good, and I'm grateful to her for that. We had a good talk. According to her, the relationship between us is still tense, but I think we're moving towards some kind of healing. My brother and I also had a good talk. It was nice to talk to him in person. He apologized for everything that happened, and I accepted his apology. Obviously, he feels guilty about how everything turned out. I definitely don't hold a grudge against him. My former fiancé and I talked almost all night. We've been communicating by phone for a couple of weeks. Most of the conversation was about catching up. Obviously, after almost a year and a half apart, we've become completely different people. Later, we moved on to more serious topics, discussing everything that happened, how terrible it all was, and how much I was broken. She told me she's already seeing a psychologist and asked if I would like to go with her to a session on Thursday of the last week. She has done more for me than I could ever ask for, and I am truly grateful to her for that. I walked with her to the psychologist, and I think it was useful for both of us. After the session, we talked a little more and asked if she wanted to go somewhere on Saturday evening. That's the plan for now. I don't know what will come of it, but I wanted to show her that I appreciate the efforts she is making to try to fix what was destroyed. For now, things are getting better. I haven't seen my stepfather or his family since I returned home. Thanks to everyone for the support. If something new happens, I will definitely write another update. Update third. The date went very well. We had a great evening together. We had dinner, went to play arcade games. We used to do that quite often. It was my first date in almost a year and a half, and I really had a great time. After that, we returned to her place and talked a little more. We are going to discuss further steps this week before I return to California. The separation will be the hardest part, but I think it will help us keep a sober view of things if we are not constantly together. Thanks again to everyone for the support. Update fourth. Many have asked about the next update. Regular communication with my mother. We are rebuilding our relationship and there is definitely progress. I am truly glad she is back in my life, even if it takes time for everything to return to the way it was. My former fiancé and I have been discussing at length what to do next. She flew in to spend time with me, and it was very nice. At the moment, we are not together, and I think that's right. As for my former stepfather, I have no information about what is happening with him. He tried to contact my mother several times after everything that happened, but he never managed to talk to her. He hasn't tried to contact me, and that's good. I hope I never meet him again. Life has changed. In the end, I moved again for a new job. Now I am in several states away from my family, and I think it's beneficial for everyone. Thanks to everyone for the support in this crazy story. So, be sure to write in the comments what you think about this whole story. I just don't understand why the mother stopped communicating with her son. Well, okay, he cheated on his girlfriend, so what? Damn it, it's life. It happened. But she's still a mother. She should have held on to him all the time. The New Year's incident, in my opinion, also doesn't justify the mother in any way. After all, no matter how you look at it, a son is one, and this is one of the most, if not the most, precious person in life. And the fiancé should have talked to him, looked at the same phone, looked at those evidence for truthfulness, so to speak, checked everything. After all, the stepfather could have been suspected in this, and the screenshots could have been faked. Why could the stepfather have been suspected? Because he had a similar precedent when he said he would pay the rent, but didn't tell anyone. That is, he could have been making such plans, it was already clear even before that. But the fiancé, in principle, can still be understood in this situation. Of course, the stepfather is some kind of evil genius who came up with such a plan, but he didn't coordinate it with his son. And as a result, it turned out that the son didn't need this fiancé at all. Well, this is some kind of nonsense. So much effort and poof. In general, write in the comments if you agree with me. Also, watch our previous video, which you will see here, and good luck.